If you like history, this book is absolutely fascinating. Mayday 1971 by Lawrence Roberts. The subtitle, A White House at War, A Revolt in the Streets, and the Untold History of America's Biggest Mass Arrest. So, as the title of this book implies, this is about the Mayday protest that happened in 1971. Kind of. Mayday is traditionally May 1st. These protests happened actually on May 3rd because the purpose of the protest was to try to shut down the federal government. In 1971, May 1st was on a Saturday, and so the protest to shut down the government was on the first working day of the week, May 3rd. But actually, the book is really about the 3 months, March, April, and then the first week of May, and then the aftermath of it. So it's not just the story of one day. It's the story of 3 months and the lead up to those 3 months and the fallout from those 3 months. So just to set the stage briefly here, this was a protest in Washington, D.C., in America, against the American involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, as the author makes clear in this book, at this stage in the anti-war movement, the anti-war movement had been going on since 1965, and it had been getting bigger and growing in momentum each year. And yet, the war in Vietnam showed no signs of stopping. The American troops on the ground had been reduced under Nixon, but the bombing still intensified, and the geographic area of the war was now spreading, with incursions into Cambodia and Laos under Nixon. So the anti-war movement was very frustrated. They felt like they had tried protesting, they had tried petitioning, they had tried marching, and nothing was working. So they were moving into mass civil disobedience. They wanted to still be nonviolent. Well, most of them wanted to still be nonviolent. That split is actually one of the major themes in this book. But they wanted to move from, I believe the phrase is from civil disobedience to resistance. Am I getting that right? So instead of just passively sitting down in the street, they wanted to do a lot more active things like actively blocking traffic, actively pulling stuff into the road to block the traffic with, running around instead of just sitting down and waiting to be arrested. And the idea was that they were going to try to shut down Washington, D.C. for one day. There's a quote here from one of the organizers of the Mayday rally, which was made into a button. Let's see, can you see that here? If the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government. So that this was the slogan of the Mayday rally. Now, this was paradoxically perhaps the height of the anti-war movement and the end of the anti-war movement. After this, the anti-war movement largely petered out for a number of reasons. Let me know what your impression of Mayday 1971 is or was. I was, for years, quite interested in the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. And I feel like I barely heard about Mayday 1971. I mean, of course, you hear about Chicago, right? You hear about the moratorium march against the Vietnam War in 1969. You hear about Kent State in 1970. But this one always struck me as something that barely gets mentioned in the histories of the period. For example, in the Ken Burns documentary series on the Vietnam War, he does mention it very briefly. I think he devotes like all of 10 seconds to it. A lot of other histories of the anti-war movement seem to not even mention it. The author of this book has some theories about why it's largely forgotten, namely that it got overshadowed by events before it, and especially after it, because right after Mayday 1971 came just scandal after scandal for the Nixon administration. There was the release of the Pentagon Papers, something I've talked about before on this channel, and we'll try and remember to leave a link to that in the description down below. And then there was Watergate. Of course, before that, there was any number of major events in the 1960s. But, yeah, let me... Well, actually, before I get into really dissecting the events in this book, let me just give this a general recommendation. This is a very readable book, very well written. It's a good example of narrative history done right. In my experience, the people who write the best narrative history tend to have journalism backgrounds or journalistic backgrounds. And according to his bio here, Lawrence Roberts does have such a background. So he is able to write a compelling narrative here that reads in many ways like a story. He's interviewed a lot of the people from these days, both on the Nixon side and on the protester side who are still living. He's woven their stories into his narratives. It's incredibly well researched, but it doesn't feel academic at all. It really feels like it feels quite character driven. So if you're interested in history, if you like a good narrative history, if you're at all interested in this period, or even if you're just interested in history generally, I would recommend this book. I really found this to be a good read. Okay, with that out of the way, maybe I'd like to spend the rest of this review talking about some of the things in this book I found interesting, and maybe we can talk together about some of the interesting things from this period. So one of the things which makes this book interesting is there were a lot of different forces vying for power and control on both sides. So you have the anti-war movement, and then you have the Nixon administration, the forces of the government. But within that, there is a lot of tension and differing ideologies. And if you like that sort of complexity, if you want to kind of get in under the wheels and see what was happening behind the scenes and the different personality conflicts, this book does a really good job of it, especially in the beginning chapters when he's setting up kind of the history to this period leading up to this demonstration and what's going on the opposite sides. So it's all in a lot more detail in this book, obviously, but just to kind of give a taste of it. On the Nixon side, you have a clash between the Nixon hardliners and the Nixon moderates. You also have a rather uneasy alliance between the Nixon administration and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is actually someone I've also talked about on this channel before. Remind me to leave a link to that video in the description down below. Both J. Edgar Hoover and Nixon share a deep contempt for the radicals in the anti-war movement, but they also have their own turf to protect. J. Edgar Hoover gets very upset when one of Nixon's men is trying to bypass him on a series of illegal surveillance plans that he wants to unleash. Nixon on his end, or the Nixon administration, is waiting for Hoover to retire because Hoover is past his prime at this point, and they're trying to hint that maybe he should be on his way out. There's also the police chief of Washington, D.C., which I didn't know this, but at this point in Washington, D.C. history, they did not have municipal independence. They were just under the government, the federal government directly. So the police chief is answering directly to the Nixon administration, who is responsible for his success or failure in the department, his promotion or demotion. The police chief is much more moderate. That's a man named Jerry Wilson, who, when he is confronted with the problem of a massive protest, he views it purely in logistical terms. So we have this many people here. How do we clear the streets effectively? How many buses do we need? How many police do we need? How can we move this many people out of the city without causing any problems? Just purely in terms of logistics. But he is needing to cooperate with the Nixon ideologues who are viewing this as an ideological struggle. These are evil protesters who need to be absolutely crushed. And so all that is very interesting on the government side. Now, on the anti-war side, it's an even bigger mess. So at this point in the anti-war movement, I mentioned earlier in the video there was some frustrations about the failure of the anti-war movement to end the war. And some of the factions were beginning to split off into violence, most notably the Weathermen or the Weather Underground, who were planning a series of bombings. And the book opens with one of their most successful bombings, which was a bombing in the Capitol building. So as the book makes clear, the security procedures in 1971 were a lot less than today. They were pretty much non-existent. And it's largely because of this event that those first security measures took place. But I guess it was a more innocent time back in 1971. So the Weather Underground were able to walk right in to the Capitol building, posing as tourists. They were able to duck away from the tour group and just leave some explosives in a bathroom, timed to go off at 1 o'clock. And nobody was injured because it was after hours and they made a phone call ahead of time asking to evacuate the building. But it did create a lot of damage, and it was this big explosion which went off right in the Capitol. As the author of this book points out, it was one of the few explosive attacks in the Capitol, and the only one since World War I. So that's going on. Now, the organizer of the Mayday protest is Rennie Davis. He was one of the Chicago 8 or the Chicago 7, another topic I've talked about on this channel before. Remind me to put the links in the description down below. Rennie Davis is doing a lot of work to try and organize this broad coalition to come to the anti-war march on May Day, and he's having to wrangle the usual problems of getting old people, getting young people, getting people from all walks of life. And he knows that this bomb is going to go off because his brother is actually part of the Weather Underground. So he's trying to negotiate with the Weather Underground. Don't do this. It's going to impede our momentum organizing for the May Day protest. He's ultimately unsuccessful. Rennie Davis and David Dillinger, another member of the Chicago 7, are organizing this protest. They're with some sort of group called the People's Coalition, I believe, and they're wrangling for control of it with a very orthodox Trotskyist group. Now, the Trotskyist group is considered part of the conservative left because they're part of the old left from the 1930s and the 1950s. They're butting heads with the new left, which is the protest movement in the 1960s. Trotskyist movement wants everyone just to march out on the streets in a show of force. They don't want to do any sort of civil disobedience, like sitting down and doing sit-ins or civil disobedience. So those two groups are going to have to try and come into some sort of an agreement before the major march. There's also the Yippie Party, which was founded by Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, both of the Chicago 7, and their less famous friend, Stu Elbert. Now, Stu Elbert is actually one of the main point of view characters for this book. Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman are off on the sidelines for the most part, although they both make appearances. One of the things that I didn't know is that Hoffman and Rubin had stopped speaking to each other by this point because of their conflicts over the control and finances of the Yippie Party. But they I mean, not to spoil too much, but they end up meeting briefly in this book when they are both arrested during the protests in Mayday. Yeah, so, I mean, you get the idea. There's just a lot of fascinating stuff going on as the author is briefly sketching both the history of the anti-war movement and the history of the Nixon administration and its reaction to that. And a lot of those events, like the Weathermen bombing in the Capitol, happened in March of 1971. Then we get to April of 1971, where there was a separate but related protest going on at the Capitol. Now, this was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War protest. Let's see, can you see that picture here? This might be more familiar because this featured very prominently in the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War. It's also featured prominently in some other series on the Vietnam War. So if you've seen those documentaries, you know what I mean. This is the one where there's that big fence that's separating the Vietnam veterans against the war from the Capitol. And they all make speeches in front of the fence, and then they throw their medals over the fence, saying, you know, we don't want these medals anymore. They don't mean anything to us. And that was led by John Kerry here, who was also testifying before Congress. So that is happening in April, and that's related to the Mayday protest. Some of the same, the organizers were coordinating with each other, but it's also separate, and that makes up the events of April. And then there are the Mayday demonstrations themselves, where the purpose of these demonstrations was to shut down Washington, D.C. The Nixon administration got very paranoid or very worried about those protests. And they did not want the protesters to be able to shut down Washington, D.C. or create any kind of victory. So as it is recreated in this book, but with a number of archival documents and recordings that the author has gone through, the Nixon administration essentially decided to preemptively arrest everyone who might cause trouble early on in the protest. So there was a little bit of streets being blocked on the morning of May 3rd, and then the police just did a dragnet where they went through the city and they arrested anyone who looked like they could potentially be sympathetic to the anti-war movement, which basically meant just anyone who was young and had long hair. And as a result, we end up with America's biggest mass arrest. I believe it was 7,000 people arrested in the dragnet, although there are some different numbers here because it depends if you count only the people who were arrested on that day or if you count the people who were arrested all during that week. I think if it's all the people who were arrested that week, it's about up to 12,000, with a high estimate in this book of 15,000, which is one of the defense lawyers used at one point. But the author said that that's probably a high estimate. So I don't know. 7,000 people arrested in one day. Most of them on no charge, just picked up on the street because they looked young and radical. Sorry, I shouldn't say most. I'm a lot of them on no charge. I'm unclear actually if that was the majority of the arrests or if that was just a lot of the arrests. I'm unclear on that. But anyways, a lot of people arrested for no reason. And the press initially was sympathetic to the police and to Nixon. So as you're reading this book, you're reading about the blatant unconstitutional acts that the Nixon administration just did because they felt like it. And reading this book, you definitely get the impression that's just the way the Nixon administration rolled. And certainly this lines up with other books I've read about the Nixon administration. Try and maybe link to some of those in the description down below if I remember. But yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. So it gets a little bit depressing because you see how easily the Constitution could be subverted. I mean, we have these Constitution, we have all these rights enshrined, and then the Nixon administration just decides to ignore it, and some of their allies in the courts go along with it, and there's nothing anybody can do. But the book actually ends on an optimistic note, because after that initial week, then the backlash began, and then lawyers get involved, and the American Civil Liberties Union gets involved, and the judges start reacting to what Nixon administration has done, and there were a whole bunch of rulings that came out of this. And in the second to the last chapter here, Aftermath, the author talks about all the different legal ramifications that have come out of it, which still affects us today. So as a result of the rulings that the courts had made in the aftermath of the Mayday demonstration, a lot of those rights are more strongly protected now. So it's an interesting book for what is largely a forgotten period of history. And again, Mayday 1971 is largely forgotten, right? Or is it just me? Let me know what your impression of it is. Yeah, and you definitely get the sense that the author has a message that he wants to get across, which is that abuses from the powerful people do happen. The people in power are not interested in restraining their power. They want to abuse their power. But there are checks and balances on that, and you need to, or I guess we as a society, need to be vigilant and fight back when we see those abuses happening. And then there's a little tidbit that's right at the very end, in the epilogue. Let me see. I think this is on the very last page. Yeah, the very last page, right before the acknowledgments, where the author is talking about the criminal histories of the people who were involved in Mayday were finally destroyed on, when was it? 1987, after 16 years of arguing about it in the courts. And he just has a little note is saying, including my own criminal history, got destroyed on that day. And so right at the very end, the author reveals that he himself, at the age of 19 years old, had been a participant in these demonstrations. Up until that point, I guess I'm spoiling stuff now for people who haven't read it. But up until that point, you as the reader have no idea that the author actually was personally witness to the stuff that he's describing. He does a very good job of keeping an objective view of it throughout. So yeah, a very fascinating narrative history. I happen to be interested in this period, as I've mentioned before, and if you've been watching my videos, you've seen other videos on this period, I'm sure. But I think I think this is so well written enough that anyone interested in history would get value from this book. And yeah, whether you're particularly interested in this period or not. So a strong recommend for me. I got this book from my library. Just saw it on the library shelves, had no idea it existed, and just picked it up. So, if you can track it down at your library or on Amazon, I definitely recommend it.